Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Linda Alcoff. She is the professor at Hunter College and Graduate Center City University, New York, and co-director of the Mellon Public Humanities and Social Justice Program. We're talking about her article in Critical Philosophy of Race called The Life of Charles Mills, Radical Philosopher Extraordinaire. Dr. Alcoff, it's a joy to have you today.
Happy to be here.
So, Dr. Alcoff, kind of an incredible moment to be able to write this. Why is Charles Mills important? Why do we need to learn about him? And why were you a great pick to write about that?
Well, he had, a lot of interlocutors and fans and people who use his work. So I was just one of many, but he and I were close friends for, 30 years at least, and sort of grew up together. I mean, we started out as untenured assistant professors when we first met, working in some similar areas, and started a conversation. So I knew him. He knew my family, my kids, my husband. I knew some of his family. So I knew the context that he grew up in and that influenced some of his ideas. And so that's what I tried to write about, because when you read his work, he does have some autobiographical thoughts and reflections in some of his essays, but he, I think, needs to be read in the context of his particular individual experiences and histories, political experiences in particular, in a way that I think he's often not. So I wanted to sort of correct the record and give my take on how some of his major contributions to the methodology of political philosophy came about. So I think he just is so important, because he not only develops an analysis of race and racism and colonialism, but he gives us a different take on the methodology of political philosophy. His argument was that when he came to the United States in the late 80s and discovered that philosophy graduate students did not think, at least where he was teaching, they did not think that racism was still a problem, or they didn't really understand how structural it was in the history of the United States political institutions and political thinking. And so he was astounded at this, and so he began to think methodologically, what is going on in political philosophy such that we can put questions of racism and colonialism to the side. So I think that those methodological interventions he made are the ones that will have a very lasting effect on philosophy going forward.
Absolutely. So what are some of those misconceptions that you feel like you're correcting? What do you think people often get wrong when approaching his work?
Well, he's famous for this concept of the epistemology of ignorance. And I think there's other people who are also developing it, like Nancy Tawana, around the same time. But Charles has a particularly good articulation of it as a situation in which it's not that you lack knowledge, it's that you are knowing in a certain way that curates what you're paying attention to and what you're considering and reflecting about. So the epistemology of ignorance is to look at what are those epistemic practices that keep us in our bubbles and keep us from seeing sometimes what's right in front of our face or really thinking about it. And that idea is very much connected to his analysis of white ignorance, which he wrote a lot about. It's certainly, white ignorance is like the paradigm case. It's not the only case of it, but it is kind of a paradigm case of the epistemology of ignorance. And you can see it in opinion polls, which have changed and improved in my lifetime, in Charles' lifetime, but are still indicative of certain misconceptions. So the epistemology of ignorance idea that he developed came out, it was very much connected to the problem of white ignorance that he was interested in. But it wasn't only connected to white ignorance. It also, I think the first formulation of it comes from his work on what happened in left social movements in the Caribbean that he was involved in. He was involved in the Workers' Party of Jamaica, that was a Marxist-Leninist party when he was a young man. And he had the hope, as many did, that there could be a pan-Caribbean coalition, sort of like the European Union, in which you could have regional cooperation and social democracy or socialism across the domain. And in that way, the formerly enslaved nations and formerly colonized countries could pool their resources and negotiate more effectively with the rich countries of the global north. So so he was in Jamaica, but he was thinking about and talking to people in other parts, especially of the Black Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, but they also were thinking about, at one point he had the aspiration, he wanted to learn French, Spanish, Portuguese, along with his English, because he wanted to learn all the Caribbean languages. He didn't totally succeed, but he worked on it. But so he was in conversation and in political collaboration with activists across the Caribbean. And Grenada had a socialist president who was elected, Maurice Bishop, by popular acclaim, who was very popular and widely supported, voted into office. And his presidency ended in catastrophe. And it was before the United States invaded Grenada, which people might recall, there was actually an internal fight within Grenada that led to the assassination of Maurice Bishop by the political movement, some of the political movement that had gotten him into power. And this was shocking to everybody. And so Charles went and he interviewed members of the New Jewel movement in Grenada about their reasoning. Like, how did this happen? How did this colossal mistake happen? And he began to develop his notion of epistemology of ignorance there as well. So I'm arguing it's a wider problem than just white ignorance. It's something that we need to think about and as forms of elitism. That's the problem that he found in the Marxist-Leninist movement in Grenada. And he used that to critique some tendencies that were also happening in Jamaica, in which the people who could wield the theory would determine the strategy and tactics and the agenda and the goals of the movement. And people who hadn't gone to college and were part of the movement were really just followers. They weren't seen as having knowledge. But of course, the tradition of resistance in the Caribbean is long standing, and it's across class, and it's widespread. That's what's so inspiring. That's why we all know about, Jamaican music everywhere around the world, because it has had a really inspiring record of resistance, cultural resistance, but the cultural resistance was also politically informed, right? It was also, and you see it in the language, you see it in the slang, you see it in the dance and the music, and you see it in the politics. So there was knowledge to be had from all classes in Jamaica, in Grenada, Charles believed, and that knowledge was being stifled by a certain elitism that cultivated a kind of ignorance. So I don't trust my own ideas and assumptions, and I silence them, and then all of that knowledge is lost to the movement. So I wanted to add that in because he did a huge amount of work on that throughout the 1980s, and he continued to think about those issues later on as a corrective to some of the negative tendencies in some. It wasn't all of Marxism, obviously. There's lots of democratic forms of Marxist movements, but in some forms of the Marxist movements that were still strong in the 1980s.
A lot of the work I do in this podcast is I'm trying to bridge these kind of interdisciplinary gaps. And I understand that the idea of like, this is a universal human thing, maybe perhaps I should say a common human epistemological practice, where we talk about we have to have some kind of way to filter information, right? We're constantly assaulted with way too much information, something as we learn as children's. Like, this is not, we don't see the cube, we see a cube instead of seeing all the flat surfaces at once. We categorize it, we lump it together, that sort of thing. So if I'm understanding you correctly, I just want to make sure I'm on the right track here. It is a common, and this isn't to say that it's the right thing. It's just or that it doesn't need correction. It's a common human thing to filter out things that are actually harmful, or to filter out things in a way that's harmful. And so it's not just a white ignorance thing, though that is kind of right now the preeminent example. It is a common human practice to filter out things that leave us blind to things that harm us or those around us. Is that another way of thinking about this?
Yes, I think that's true, but I would make one additional point.
Yeah.
Which Charles made as well, which is that when you're kind of on top of things, you can glide along without knowing a lot of stuff. You don't really need to know what your servants think of you, because who cares? They don't like you can get another one. But when you're a servant, as many people have written about this, including Du Bois, you have to know how your masters think, their belief system, their foibles, their fears, their needs. And you also have to know your own and the people that you are close to. So you don't have the luxury of being as ignorant as some people do. So ignorance can be a kind of a luxury.
Yeah.
that isn't distributed terribly, equally. And that's not to say it doesn't break down in any simplistic way by class or by race or gender, but there is a way in which sometimes we can be insulated from the impact of our ignorance, whereas other people may not be insulated from the impact of their ignorance. They could really get into trouble.
Right.
They don't understand, what's going on.
To take a really classic example, I think everyone would understand. It's part of the reason why The Prince and the Pauper is so um, is kind of universally beloved, right? This idea of a prince and the like doesn't know how to bathe himself, wash, like clothe himself, how to feed himself. He has to learn all these really basic things. That's like, how do you not know how to do that? But that's just that you get to choose what you want to learn about when you can just tell someone else to do something for you. And that's just one side of it. I understand that there's there's a tremendous amount of privilege that comes with that too, and it's very punitive, right? To those around you, but not to yourself. So if I'm ignorant of someone else, but I'm on top, and I do something that makes their life very hard, that's going to be more common if I'm on top.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're below,
I think that's true, but I think it's also true what you said earlier, that we do have a tendency to want to avoid painful topics, painful information, and just death. I mean, I teach existentialism. The kids sometimes they don't want to talk about death. Some of them don't. Sometimes at 19 they really do want to talk about death. But they're surprised. I mean, because most of the time we don't talk about death. We don't talk about dying. We don't talk about death. And naturally, who wants to? But of course, the existentialists argue that actually it can really improve your life.
Well, I love that too, that sometimes they really want to talk about it. I think it's sometimes you get a 19-year-old who's like, it's easy to talk about death because obviously that happens to other people, right? Talking about epistemological ignorance right there.
Right.
So you mentioned this in passing, well, not in passing, but you kind of listed it out. Can you talk a little bit more about those everyday practices of cognitive resistances that that Dr. Mills would have learned in Jamaica? How do you see like the music show up, the dance, the slang, and of course the politics? I mean, I think you touched on that a little bit more, but I'd love to hear how kind of those everyday things show up in his work.
Yeah, there's this. He wrote a whole paper on this slang concept that I'd never heard of from Jamaica called smattitizing. And it's just kind of a very common kind of word that's used among all classes of people. And the way he explains it is that it really gestures at one's status in the social world, one's subjective status in the social world, as philosophers would talk about it. So that oppression wasn't just denial of material goods. It wasn't just economic. It wasn't just about how much money or land you have. It was also about whether or not you're seen as a person in a full sense. And that's another, concept that Charles develops. It's very famous, of being a sub-person. There's persons in European modernity, and then there's sub-persons, almost persons, not full persons, in the philosophical sense of personhood, meaning that you have the power to govern yourself, which is a very important idea in European modernity. Is self-governance is the way in which Europe overcame ideas of aristocracy and monarchy, was through ideas of self-governance. So that concept of personhood was central to political philosophy, to argue that democracy was possible, democracy was feasible, because all persons have the capacity for self-governance. We have the capacity to reflect, to not just, go for the quick outcome, but to actually, control ourselves, reflect on ourselves, and govern ourselves. And we can do this collectively, and we can do this in political form. But not everybody was seen as capable of that. So all kinds of racist ideas characterized numbers of peoples in the world as really incapable of self-governance because they were overly emotional, because they relied on intuitions, they didn't have the intelligence, they didn't have the self-control, they didn't have the capacity for virtue. All women, mostly were put into this category.
Yep.
So semanticizing was this concept that was like used in slang in Jamaica, and he, really unpacked it. He really focused on it, unpacked it, and saw it as an indication of a certain knowledge and conceptualization of a kind of sub-person status, but that semanticizing was to assert one's personhood, right? It was to make visible one's full personhood as a subject with their own views and their own agency. And so he used that, I think, both epistemologically to sort of go against elitist ideas that you have to go to college to understand how social oppression works. Actually, you don't need to go to college to understand how social oppression works. Although it's great to be able to go to college now and study it, which wasn't the case when I was in college initially, or Charles too much. But the knowledge was there, and also the resistance was there, the form of resistance, and that we, college professors, have something to learn from that, which he, did. He and went on to develop his concept of sub-personhood from that concept.
I'm really glad. I was going to ask you about semanticizing, and I'm glad you said it first because I had no idea how to say it. So that's one. Thank you. Also, really, definitely something I would love to take away from this is I love having better vocabulary for this sorts of the idea of encapsulating the struggle for personhood in one concept is very helpful. So thank you for that. Who would you say you kind of mentioned Du Bois? Who were some of the biggest influences? Even you're talking about it was hard to find people to study, or hard. It wasn't like you had classes, critical race classes when you first started out. And so, who were some of the biggest influences on Dr. Charles Mills?
Well, probably, one of the biggest was actually Karl Marx. He wrote his dissertation on Karl Marx's theory of ideology. He went to University of Toronto to get his PhD in philosophy because they had two Marxists on the faculty that he worked with, both of them. And, Marx was also thinking a lot about social oppression in a broad sense, and he was thinking also methodologically about how to change economics and how to change political theory so that certain things like alienation and exploitation would become visible, and we could pinpoint it, we could name it. So Marx, I think, was a huge influence. And, Charles wrote his, I think, dissertation on ideology because that issue was like, why it was so important to answering the question of why we haven't made progress more quickly because of the ways in which ideologies infect our theoretical work and our philosophical work and our ideas across the public domain. So I think when he decided to shift from working on class primarily to working on race primarily, he wrote in one place that he wanted to think like Marx, though, the way Marx thought about class. Marx did not think class was a natural kind. Classes weren't given by God. They weren't part of nature. They were produced under certain very particular political and economic conditions. They had a historical time frame. And that's the way Charles thought about racial identities. They weren't natural kinds. They were created under very specific conditions, and they were historical. And so he used Marxist methodology, but he also, had many influences. He actually, when he sort of realized in the late 80s that the political philosophy of the Anglo-American world was not going to be a place where he was going to be able to theorize racial oppression or colonial oppression. It just wasn't on the agenda. There wasn't a terminology. There wasn't a discussion. There wasn't a debate. There weren't competing theories. It really wasn't on the map. He started reading history and political theory and sociology and other, disciplines. And so he was influenced by a lot of the historians who were changing the map of, like Eugene Genovese, who were bringing slavery to the fore of U.S. history and also the economy of the global North. A number of historians were doing that to sort of show how integrated practices of slavery and colonialism were to the developing modern economies. So he was very influenced by people outside of philosophy as well. And then, he started to read in a serious and, very systematic way the work of the great liberal theorists, Kant and Rawls, and started to engage in a tug of war with them, which he continued through his life. So to draw out what he thought were actually wonderful ideas of self-governance and of justice, but that had some huge gaping holes that it suggested methodological problems that he wanted to point out and to develop so that we could use what is good about their work, but really, we had to go right to the roots to start from a different place. So his last book, which is not out yet, but it is being revised because he had it in almost a complete manuscript. It's being revised by his literary editor, Chike Jeffers, who was his former student at Northwestern. The name of that book, I wanted to tell you, is White Leviathan.
Oh no.
He's taking it from Hobbes.
Yes. Yeah. Right? I'm not referencing Hobbes, but yes, that does. Yeah. Oh, that's a little close to home.
Well, it's not, but he thinks the concept is very useful and constructive to think about, like the whole large apparatus that we are working inside of.
Yeah.
And with, but he's looking at the history of European modern liberal political theory as, one that really is theorizing from within what is actually a white leviathan. It's not actually the whole thing. And that's how they formulate, some of their arguments. So that's going to be the title of the book.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really glad you brought that up. That's great. I'll definitely keep an eye out. Maybe Dr. Jeffords would be willing to come on when the book comes out. That would be fun. But you've mentioned a couple times now, and I think you've definitely explained it a little bit. But can you talk a little bit more about his focus on political methodology and how he was able to create his own methodology and what he felt he was correcting with that?
Well, I think the epistemology of ignorance is important to focus not just on knowing well, but also knowing badly. Now, in epistemology, this is a big topic, like why there's so much fake news and deep fakes and how these things get circulated. So there's a lot of focus on bad epistemic practices and not just normatively positive epistemic practices. But the other methodological breakthrough that I think he really helped along was this move from ideal theory to non-ideal theory. And again, he wasn't the only one thinking about this. Honora O'Neill did some excellent work critiquing abstraction in political philosophy that Charles made use of and knew about and wrote about, and some other people. But the idea is that political philosophers, like you think about Plato, are thinking about are asking the question, what would a just society look like? But they're not asking, what would our society look like if it was just, but just, imagining a completely decontextualized, some non-specific, just conglomeration of, individuals thrown together in a particular place and time without any history, without any particular groups of people who are contending with each other in the space. There's no historical background. There's no realism to the way in which Plato asked the question, what is a just society? And Rawls replicates that largely in his theory of justice that came out in 1970, and Kant replicates it. So this idea that we can abstract away our particular challenges to try to create democratic and just societies, that are particular challenges that we have because of history and histories of colonialism, etc., can just be set aside, and we can still formulate the generalized norms of justice and of relations and democracy. And so he argues this is why political philosophy skipped over these problems, and we're not addressing race, and that if you start from non-ideal conditions, so in other words, you start from the real world, because the real world is decidedly non-ideal.
Last time I checked, yes.
Yeah, look out the window.
Yeah.
It causes you to ask different kinds of questions. And, I know that because I do Latin American philosophy. I'm originally from Latin America. I'm an immigrant. This was a standard practice in the whole tradition of political philosophy in Latin America. Simón Bolívar, after winning the independence from Spain in the early 1800s, asked the question, how can we create a democratic society that includes the formerly enslaved who have been denied education and traumatized, the indigenous people who have been displaced from their land and subject to genocide, and then these European settlers who are also here, many of whom came, for reasons of economic desperation themselves. They weren't doing so well in Europe. So these are the three groups. And so Bolivar asked the question, how do we create a democracy given these groups? How are we going to create a shared sense of political purpose? And Jose Marti, the other great political thinker, who's a Cuban guy, writing in the later part of the 1800s, does the same thing. Jose Vasconcelos, Juan Carlos Mariátegui does the same sort of question. what is our ode to the enslaved? What are our ode to the indigenous? Should we all try to make amalgamation? Should we have separate land rights for the indigenous? That's what Mariátegui argued. So you get very different conceptions of justice than you have if you take the polity made up of abstract individuals with no history and no particular grievances and claims and conditions that pose challenges to our coming together in a shared, workable, participatory, as participatory as possible democracy. So he does a critique of ideal theory, and then he develops a methodology for doing non-ideal theory, and that has just swept social theory today. It's not it's not hegemonic. Not everybody is doing non-ideal theory, but a lot more people are doing non-ideal theory today, and I think it's going to have a lasting impact in the topics that we address, but also the solutions, because the solutions in the ideal abstract world are not necessarily going to be the solutions that work in the non-ideal conditions. So the norms of governance, the norms of political participation, the norms of social interaction are impacted by. So I'll just give you one other applied example. When we talk about things like affirmative action, or sometimes it's called reverse discrimination, or positive discrimination. In Europe, it's called different things, which is the idea that you try to correct for past discrimination, and if you have two candidates of equal qualifications for a job, and one of them is from a group of people that have been unfairly kept out of a particular profession, you give the job to that person rather than you give the jobs to the other person. So it's not about ignoring qualifications. But this policy, affirmative action, has been debated for 50 years. And it's been some very good work on it. But what it has to, the way we have to make the argument in places like the United States and Europe is we have to say, well, liberalism says treat all the people the same. But in just this one instance, just this temporary period, under these very constrained conditions, we're going to deviate from the abstract universal norms that we know to be true. And so that puts affirmative action, on the back foot. So it's always like having to prove something, that it's not as unjust as it looks from liberal universal ideal theory. And so by starting from non-ideal conditions, we can think about, what do we want here? We want a society in which we have common interests, in which we get along instead of fighting with each other, in which we have a sense that there's justice for all, and there's a possibility of working together productively. So we all have an interest in overcoming the non-ideal conditions in our societies. Maybe we're not going to get all the way to the ideal, but overcoming those kinds. It's not just that some groups have an interest in overcoming non-ideal conditions, right? It's all of us have an interest in overcoming non-ideal conditions. So you can still get a sense of collectivity and commonality and common political norms and ethical norms that take into account everybody. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not where you're taking from some and then messing up those people that you're taking from and then giving it to others who are then exalted. It's actually, you're still thinking about the whole. You're still thinking about how to create a workable polity. But you sometimes may use things like affirmative action to get there.
Yeah, even as you were talking about this, there's the solution aspect. There's also, as you talk about ideal theory, it's very easy when you create this ahistorical ideal to allow your personal or your own very narrow cultural preferences to slip in. And I love that you started with Plato, because as you're talking about Dr. Mills and your own work, talking about his use of dance and music and slang, and of course, what what do we see in Plato? Plato's, like, well, the only kind of music you can have is military music, and the only kind of dance is for like fighting. And then all the rest of it you kick out, and all the poets too. And it's like, it's really like, this feels more like a Plato thing, like than a just society thing, right? Like it's like, because if you avoid this kind of pure ideal, like you start having to talk to actual people, and you have to compromise, and then you're like, oh, that was just me being weird, that's. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's something I latched onto.
No, the Republic was like a fascist document. That's what I wrote an undergraduate paper making that argument, which was crazy. But the myth of the metals. Come on, there's gold people, silver people, and brass people. Your livelihood is forever determined in this way. Yeah, I mean, Plato was, a mixed bag. Like most of our great philosophers, he actually was more egalitarian on gender issues than many people later than him. So, there's things to learn from all of these people. But, yeah, the Republic is not exactly democratic.
Oh, man. No, definitely not. I want to be respectful of your time, but sorry, I got I don't know why that really got me. Kind of like before we wrap up here, I did want to ask you, obviously heavily influenced by Karl Marx. How do you what do you think about Dr. Mill's views on liberalism?
Yeah, we didn't always agree.
I was actually asking you to explain it. If you want to talk about your own discussions with him, that is okay. I was not looking up to bring up beef between you and Dr. Mills.
I think a lot of us, wanted to go with him and toward the non-ideal approach all the way, and we're concerned. But I think what Charles wanted to do was he wanted to correct the record on the history of liberalism, for one thing, and say that the fact that it was never extended to women, to people who were colonized subjects, and so forth, that wasn't just a small piece of it. That wasn't just a deviation. There are certain ways in which the concepts, and the methods like abstraction and idealization created the conditions for those exclusions. So he wanted to argue that the sort of exclusion clauses were really substantive, but he also wanted to argue that liberalism, and this was his argument against a lot of postmodernists and some of the radical critics of liberalism. He wanted to also argue that liberalism was not hardwired to be racist. It wasn't it wasn't there wasn't a preordained logic of liberalism.
There wasn't an ideal liberalism.
Yeah, that was always in every formulation going to end up with all these exclusion clauses for all these groups of people. So he thought that there were elements of liberalism, even in Kant and Rawls, that could be drawn from and that were important to draw from. So he remained very much influenced by a Marxist tradition and a social approach to individuals and a historical approach. But he thought that we needed to include the protections of individual liberty and the recognition of individual self-governance that liberalism developed. So he thought there could be a kind of reformed liberalism or transformed liberalism that would be a part of, a new political theory that could help us find a way forward. So he didn't need to stay only inside the sphere of liberalism. He drew from the socialist tradition and communitarian traditions. He's very influenced by Du Bois, but he did not think that, and I think he's right about this, because I think that philosophical theories are historical and dynamic and organic and changing and subject to different interpretation. It's kind of like, this may be a weird analogy, but Christianity, right? If you think about Christianity, which is a tradition that I'm inside of and that I have a lot of respect for, but it has generated some of the worst violence and genocides and wars and destructions in history of our sectors of the world. And it also has elements that go absolutely against all of those things. So it's the way in which it's interpreted and the way in which it's wielded isn't completely determined by the text itself. Although I think, there's a lot of Jesus's teachings that are pretty unambiguous, but they get misconstrued. So I think liberalism is like that. I think liberalism, he saw liberalism certainly as like that, as a great tradition that had a lot of positive elements, but those are always subject to interpretation, and they're always subject to analysis of who they apply to, how they apply under these conditions. And so he saw liberalism as open rather than closed. It's not that Kant was getting it wrong. It's that Kant formulated it in a certain way, but there are pieces of Kant's arguments for self-governance that can be accepted and developed in a way that doesn't have the exclusion clauses.
And we haven't mentioned it, at least I don't think we have, but a lot of what we're talking about is contained in Dr. Mill's book, The Racial Contract.
Yes.
So for those people who aren't familiar with Dr. Mill's, that if you're looking for the kind of the formulation of this, in a lot of ways you're looking for that book. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that was his first book. And it's a wonderful book to teach. It's a wonderful book to read because it's fast, and he gives you like this global sort of history to really help you understand how we got in the world that we got. And he begins to develop these ideas of the subperson, of non-ideal theory, epistemology of ignorance. He doesn't flesh them out. So in later works, Black Rights, White Wrongs, and other books, he he fleshes out those ideas. But those ideas are in the racial contract. You'll see them in the racial contract.
So is that a good place to start, or is there something? Okay, it is a good place to start.
I think so.
Let me say thank you for coming on today. For our audience, besides reading, your article introducing us to Dr. Mills, besides reading The Racial Contract, what is something that you would encourage our audience to read or to do or to think about this week? What's one takeaway they can, after listening to this episode, that they can have to kind of meditate on the rest of this week?
This week? How about this year?
This year? Yeah, I mean, yeah, but something to really focus. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying like, we can think about this one thing, but only for the week, but something that they can kind of extra special, Well, I'm not trying to doubt that. I'm trying to put a special emphasis, not downplay what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Well, I think coming off of the book, The Racial Contract, that you introduced, what he's really doing in that book is giving us a transnational approach. So it's not about racism just in one country. It's really looking at a transnational global system, interconnecting ideas that justify colonialism. And I think that's one idea I've been trying to develop as well, is this idea that racism needs to be thought about in relationship to a much larger sense of connections between nations, regions of the world, the ways in which we think about traditional versus advanced societies, the ways in which we think about why is the global north the richest area of the world today? How did that come about? So I think Charles gives us that wider perspective because he was transnational himself, having grown up in Jamaica till he was in his mid-20s, lived in Canada for 10 years and then the United States, and then traveling all over the world. To put racism in that larger context, I think is very important.
Dr. Alcoff, it's been an absolute joy having you on today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, PJ. Good luck with the program.